You know you have quite a future in burglary. You and I can burglarize places and Jake can be Spider. Oh my god! What, Miarco? Get it? Because I'm turning into a cat? So instead of Marco, I said Miarco? It's a cat joke. It's funny. 44 pages later. I scoped out the area. You're all clear. Hey, maybe Rage. Ah! What's wrong, Miarco? Miarco. Like meow plus Marco. Meow is the sound cats make. It's funny. Tell me it's funny. Tell me I'm funny. It's nice to have this annual reason to talk about Animorphs again. Animorphs Graphix number 2 The Visitor was published in paperback, hardcover, and ebook on October 5th, 2021, and is a direct adaptation of Animorphs number 2 The Visitor, originally published in June of 1996. Holy crap, that was 25 years ago. Once again, Catherine Applegate and Applegrant's original story has been adapted and visualized by Chris Grine. Taking place a few weeks after the events of the first book, our heroes are still licking their wounds, experimenting with morphing, and trying to figure out what to do next. Rachel is concerned about her friend Melissa, who's been acting distant and abrasive these last few months. That could be normal teenage angst, or it might have something to do with her father being the controller, Vice Principal Chapman. Having an alien invader for a dad probably isn't great for emotional development of young minds. So the Animorphs decide to have Rachel morph the family cat and scout out the Chapman house to see what's up. What they find is that the Yeerks controlling Melissa's parents don't even pretend to engage in human behavior, acting cold and robotic around their daughter. Chapman keeps a holographic communicator hidden in the basement with Visor 3 on speed dial, making regular reports on the Yeerks' search for the quote-unquote Andalite bandits. There is valuable information to be discovered here, so Rachel makes another go at it, but this time catches the attention of Visor 3, who believes her to be an Andalite. He orders Chapman to bring Rachel to him and to finally infest Melissa. But then we discover that Chapman, the actual human person Chapman, became a voluntary controller in order to protect his daughter. The real Chapman confronts Visor 3, says he'll make trouble. He'll publicly fight his Yeerk if the Visor breaks the deal, forcing Visor 3 to agree. Rachel escapes, and has now found purpose in fighting the Yeerks. As you can imagine, this video will be less extensive than last year's, where we went over the historical context for Scholastic's various graphic novel projects. The context for this book is the first one sold enough to justify making another one. Also, a lot of what I said about Chris Grine's artistic style remains very true here, both the positives and the negatives, because who wants a visually inconsistent series of books? So let's run through these points again real quick. His approach to character design involves a lot of samey faces, made distinct mostly through hair color. Melissa is this book's new example of design similarity. She has some very light freckles, and her hair is a touch lighter than Rachel, but otherwise she may as well be Rachel's clone. Thankfully, the close-up of a character and you have no idea who they are problem of the first book has been avoided with better panel composition and story context. On the flip side, Grine's visions of morphing are still wonderfully grotesque. They haven't been toned down one bit. Ah! Oh! Ew! The actual animal art here is really good too. Look at that bald eagle. That is a beautiful bird. So this book carries over a lot of the good and the not so good from the previous one. The style is now set in stone, the faithfulness to the source material means there isn't a lot of narrative flexibility, we're never going to cut to any character besides Rachel to see how they're doing, and there's the heavier emphasis on dialogue, with a lot of the first-person narration lost in the process. That stuff's just never gonna change, it seems. However, this style works quite a bit better for this second outing. Not because of anything Grine or Scholastic's Graphix did, but because the book they're adapting is far more receptive to this style. Animorphs number 2, The Visitor, is a very, very different book from the first one. Number 1, The Invasion, is dense with info dumps, exposition, introducing multiple alien races and factions and technologies, introducing our main cast, and throwing in multiple adrenaline-pumping action scenes in order to hook readers and hopefully keep them coming back. Adapting that for Animorphs Graphix required a lot of compression, which included leaving a lot of character details on the cutting room floor, like why Tobias hero worships Jake, or even the basic fact that Jake and Rachel are cousins, something this second graphic novel thankfully corrects. Get out of here, accidental incest ships. In comparison, The Visitor is far slower, far quieter, and far more conversational. Its focus is less on big sci-fi ideas, as it is a small group of friends trying to decide for themselves where they stand and how they'll proceed in their defense against this alien invasion, as well as a focus on the human cost of the war, the way the Yeerks hurt families and break resolves as seen in the tragedy of the real Principal Chapman and what he sacrificed for the sake of his daughter. Grine's strengths really come through in the verbal confrontation between Chapman, temporarily allowed control over himself again, and Visitor 3, where Chapman negotiates the freedom of his daughter. We start with Chapman on the ground, the crap beat out of him, crying and on his knees before the towering Visitor, begging the Yeerk leader to keep the original deal. The Visitor, his arms crossed, says no. And then, Chapman wobbles back to his feet, and the Visitor's composure breaks. Chapman makes a threat. My daughter remains free or I'll cause problems. Visitor 3 pushes him back into the mud, but Chapman's resolve is set, his threat real. He gets back up, and he and the Visitor are now at matching eye levels, a stare down, and Visitor 3, his composure more pouty than dominant now, accepts Chapman's deal. This confrontation ends with Chapman leaving, literally taking the high ground over Visitor 3, who looks down ever so slightly, dejected. This is so good! Chris Grine really elevated Kay Applegate's dialogue through character posture and how they're framed together, the sway of a conversational battle. Without saying anything to that effect, we realize just how much of a spoiled child Visitor 3 is. Someone who, having bullied his way into a position of power, doesn't really know what to do when someone tells him no. This is the best moment, not just in this book, but in both of the Animorphs Graphix. Unfortunately, it's followed by a very clumsy action sequence of Rachel and Jake escaping the Yeerk clutches. Part of this is an issue with the original book, feeling like it needed an action climax. Like, the emotional climax with Chapman wouldn't be enough. And this action sequence just wasn't that good to begin with. It starts with Cassie and Marco starting some Earth movers, but since we're so honor-bound to Rachel's perspective, we never see Marco or Cassie. Jake seems to know they've done this, even though nobody's communicated that, and Jake, in this moment, is a flea on Rachel's back and shouldn't be able to perceive this. In the original book, it's Rachel that noticed the Earth movers have been turned on. Later, Visitor 3 has morphed this giant rock monster and is tearing up the place, and a slab of stone crashes on top of a Hork-Bajir. And then we have a panel of Jake looking right into the camera like it's The Office. Gross, dude. What even is this? That line of dialogue isn't in the original book. Grine just felt this moment needed a snarky reaction shot. And then something explodes. We never see what explodes or why. In the book we know why, because one of the Earth movers slowly bumped into a bug fighter, and bug fighters turn out to be made of petrol-soaked tissue paper, and it immediately exploded. That sucked, but unmotivated random explosions for no reason also suck. And I'm worried this is going to be indicative of action scenes going forward for this series. Missing information, conflicting information, and added moments of Marvel movie jokiness. The ending of the invasion was kind of like this too, but that scene was purposefully, outright chaotic, fighting through hysterical mobs. It made sense for that scene. As combat in these books get more precise and more violent, a little more work is going to have to be put into making them more cohesive. Plus, we still don't know how these graphic novels are going to deal when our protagonists start getting seriously hurt. We're still in the blue alien blood stage of things, and when we get to the books where Animorphs start losing limbs and having their guts torn out, Scholastic Graphix is either going to have to commit or make some major changes. And I'm worried they're not going to commit, because I'm already starting to see signs of the graphic novels trying to take things down a notch, bring it from a PG-13 to a PG. It's the small things for right now. In the original book's opening scene, when the Animorphs are trying out bird morphs and they get shot at by a couple of idiot teenagers drinking beer and shooting guns in the back of a pickup truck, this scene plays out similar in the graphic novel, except that these two are drinking soda instead of beer, because we want the two punks shooting wild animals for kicks to be good role models. And let's throw in a joke for good measure. "That bird done stole your gun, Chester, and I got real scared and spilled my soda all over my good shirt." Okay, that got a sensible chuckle out of me, but it really takes away the seriousness of the scene. We're opening our book by showing us ways humanity sucks sometimes, with senseless violence for its own sake, to contrast with humanity at its strongest with Chapman at the end of the book. Now these two are just goofy comic relief kids. And speaking of how humanity sucks, we should probably talk about that scene. The one that really killed number 2 The Visitor for me when I first reviewed it over a decade ago. The scene where Rachel fends off a rapist and then gets yelled at for doing so. Personally, I would have cut this scene entirely. It's not plot relevant at all. At best, it feels like a real amateur attempt to make the book edgy. Hey, 12-year-old reading this isn't some kiddie superhero book. There's an attempted rape scene. Animorphs got plenty dark during its run, but it very rarely felt edgy. This feels edgy. So it's potentially traumatic for some readers and narratively pointless. There's no reason the graphic novel adaptation needed to have this scene. But of course, it has this scene. So no to beer, yes to sexual assault. But there are changes. Interesting, weird changes. So put your money on if you think the changes will make the scene better or worse. First off, the character doing the assault is different. In the original book, it was a college-aged rando. In the graphic novel, it's Chester, one of the kids who is shooting guns and drinking soda. Chester cuts a far less intimidating profile than the original guy. He's shorter than Rachel. There's no way to be sure, but he might even be younger than Rachel, and he already got emasculated by Rachel at the beginning of the book. She literally disarmed him. And also, these characters are comic relief now. Chester and the Good Shirt Guy, a comedy foil duo for the ages. Yeah, you are not meant to take these two seriously, and when Chester approaches Rachel for a number, it's supposed to have all the dramatic weight of Bulk and Skull asking Kimberly out for a date on Mighty Morphing Power Rangers. Chester refers to himself in the third person. He's a total clown. You know, maybe this is why they changed the beer to soda, to make sure these two are as harmless as possible. Chester's also asking for Rachel's number, if being way too aggressive about it. The guy in the original book was very clear about his intent. His demands that Rachel get into his car was serious shit. In the graphic novel, Chester's actions are framed as inappropriate, absolutely, but he's not a threat. He's just a loser. At least, I think that's how they're trying to frame it. Rachel seems conflicted here. Some panels make her seem genuinely concerned, but then she taunts Chester into following her into an alley so that she can spring her trap on him. Look at her tee-hee got him face as she prepares to half-morph elephant and scare the crap out of him. Are we sure this is the scene we want to put Easter eggs in, guys? I just want to be clear here. What Chester is doing is still awful. He ain't gonna take no for an answer, and now he's trapped a woman in an alleyway. This is 100% harassment, and the threat of sexual assault is still very real and present, even if he's not going full grapist from the whitest kid you know. It's actually a much more common form of assault. The original books guy, driving around during the day looking for 13-year-old girls to prey on, I'm not going to say aggressive and out-in-the-open assault doesn't happen. Obviously it does, but not nearly as often as a guy trying to flirt with a woman, flunking out, and getting aggressively upset about it. In their attempts to grind down some of the edge of this scene, Grine and Scholastic somehow made it more real. Which brings us to the second half of this shit show, the victim blaming scene. The dialogue is mostly the same. Marco is the most aggressively upset, Jake is calmer, but kind of in agreement that Rachel shouldn't have morphed to protect herself. The biggest difference is a line from Cassie that thank God was cut in the graphic novel version. Cassie gave me an encouraging smile. "It was dumb putting yourself in that position, Rachel. You need to be more careful." It was Michael who wrote that bit, right? I just can't imagine Catherine having these words come out of the mouth of the other girl in the group, especially Cassie, the most empathetic one in the group. The graphic novel has Cassie far more supportive. It's not Rachel's fault that guy was harassing her. I'm just glad you're safe.
Thank you!
So besides this line of dialogue, the victim blaming scene is pretty much the same as in the original book. But what has changed is all that context from before. We go from Rachel, scared for her life, being chased by a threatening adult, and having to use her powers to save herself, to Rachel tricking a comedy relief child into following her where she can go boogity boogity. I have a terrible, sneaking suspicion that these changes were made with the intent to have Rachel actually be in the wrong, which is just... what the fuck, guys? I've never liked this scene, but in their attempt to decrease its intensity, the graphic novel somehow made it worse. Again, they could have just cut the scene entirely. That was always on the table. Alright, so that's the big stuff out of the way. A few random observations to close things out. In the opening of the flying scene, a few text boxes identifying what birds everyone's morphed into would not go amiss. Not everyone is a bird nut, and not everyone knows what a peregrine falcon looks like on sight. After bird practice, our heroes start walking home, and we get this exchange that my brain cannot wrap itself around. Marco: "Hey Jake, you want to hang out for a little while? Maybe play some games or have a snack? Maybe nachos?" Jake: "Shut up, Marco." Rachel: "Funny but gross, Marco." What? No, really, what? I swear, I'm not hiding any context here, and there's no corresponding conversation like this in the original book. I guess Chris Grine just thinks nachos are really, really gross? I have no idea what's going on here. On a more positive note, we already know Grine is really committed to making morphing as horrific as possible. Well, good news, because he's also committed to the Animorphs' various nightmares. We get a delectably horrific 2-page spread that springs on you like a jump scare. Rachel's nightmare of being a shrew just in time for Halloween. Finally, I want to talk about the ending, when Rachel leaves Melissa a note in an attempt to encourage her that her father really does love her, that there is hope. It's a small gesture, maybe even a fruitless gesture, but in such an impossible conflict as this, we do what we can. Melissa, your father loves you more than you will ever know, and more than he can ever show you. Someone who knows. P.S. What do you think of our new stationery? We hired somebody to do the graphic design. It's pretty neat. Probably should have told you to destroy this note if your dad found a piece of paper with what I guess is now the logo of the Andalite Bandits. There's no deal your father could make to save you. But we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Good luck! Post-book follow-up. I worry that these yearly graphic novel reviews are going to get pretty monotonous pretty fast, as it's clear with this second entry that Animorphs Graphix is locked into their style of adaptation. The adjustments between the first one and the second one are very slight, and while this second one is better paced, has fewer conflicts between the writing and the art, and has a stronger emotional core than the first, a lot of that comes from the source material being better suited for the project. It does play to Grine's strengths, and there are moments where this adaptation really sings, taking the original text and enhancing it in visual language. But that rigid faithfulness to the source material is an issue, because a lot of these books have some distinct problems, especially early on when the series was still finding its groove. But the only thing these graphic novels feel they can do is very small adjustments that don't really fix anything or sometimes even make it worse. The fact that so much was changed in the sexual assault scene seems like an acknowledgement that that scene had some major problems. But instead of taking a wrecking ball to it like they should have, they instead put a fresh coat of paint on it and didn't fix the core problems of gratuity and victim blaming. But, overall, I think this second attempt does enough right, and the good stuff is so good that this is a slightly better version of this story than the original book. Not by much, and not in every way, but enough to comment on. And since it's better than the first graphic novel, yeah, I'd give it a light recommendation. It'll fit in nicely with your Animorphs collection on the bookshelf. I give Animorphs Graphix #2 The Visitor a 7 out of 10.